Hello and welcome, my friends. Okay, tonight I shall tell you a couple of short stories in a row. They are short but intriguing, nevertheless. So I wanted to bundle them together in one video instead of making separate videos that would turn out to be very short clips. The first story tonight is an ancient legend that is a rather short one. Because it is a very old one, it is also lacking the details that usually give more flesh to a story. This legend is one that has been common knowledge in the rural region where my father spent his childhood years. The story deals with a place along a country road where the road makes a strong turn, and this curve in the road is called Hag's Bend. The name derives from a witch allegedly having been buried in the olden times somewhere near the bend. In the early 20th century, people would still rely largely on horses for transportation, and it was rumored that when a horse carriage, or in the winter a sleigh, would reach this bend on their way, the harness of the horse would suddenly come undone, so that it would be impossible to continue the journey without getting off the carriage and readjusting the harness. This also happened to my father's family, at least once in my father's childhood. Soon, though, they purchased their first car, and it seems that the witch was powerless against an engine-powered means of transportation, so the incident never befell them again. Alrighty, this was the first story. Again, it left me wondering if there are any similar kind of stories in other cultures that you might know of. I mean, that surely can't be too good to have a witch's grave lying around in the neighborhood, because surely there would be serious consequences to that, wouldn't there? I would be extremely interested in hearing about any similar legends and folklore stories, if you know any. Would be much obliged. Okay, on to our next tale. In my home country, in Finland, many so-called ghost sightings deal with the sighting of a loved one after their recent passing. In fact, these kinds of goodbye signs or messages from beyond are a distinct type of Finnish folklore, and at least some books that I know of have been published on the subject. Typical signs of a close one's passing are a bird knocking on window glass and, for example, the sighting of two branches or twigs on the ground forming the shape of a cross. The next story was told to my mother by one of her friends, Anne, some months after her husband's passing. This happened on a Saturday night, the typical sauna night in many Finnish homes. This time, Anne didn't feel like warming up the sauna, which was situated in a separate building across her yard. She wasn't that keen on bathing by herself and had often skipped the sauna altogether after her husband's death, while her husband He had always opted for that Saturday night tradition of relaxation. This particular Saturday night one summer, it was already getting a little bit dusky as the nightfall was approaching. Anne was walking past the large window of her living room, through which she could see the yard and the sauna building at the other side of it. As she was passing the window, she was suddenly jolted and stopped in her tracks. The sight that revealed itself outside the window was so familiar to her that at a quick glance she did not think much about it. However, while the realization came upon her, she was completely struck by the reality of what she was witnessing. She saw her husband looking exactly like he always had looked like, walking up the path from the sauna toward the house. He had been in the habit of wearing braces with his trousers, and as he had returned to the house after a bath in the sauna, his braces had typically dangled freely during the walk across the yard. This sight of him crossing the grassy area with his braces dangling by his sides had now come alive in front of Anne. He did not look transparent, nor did he look different from before in any other way. Anne watched the apparition walk toward the front door until it reached a certain point where Anne was no longer able to see it from the window. She waited to hear something at the door, but there was no sound of the door opening or any other sounds for that matter. Finally, she hurried to the door and opened it to look outside, but she was greeted by mere silence all around her. There was no one there. Okay, we have reached the end of the second story. What sort of surprises me here is that in many ghost stories, the ghost is described as a more or less shadowy figure or somewhat transparent. Or there is something else about the apparition that creates a feeling that something is off about the appearance of it. Well, in this case, Anne specifically mentioned that her husband looked perfectly normal, like on any given day during his life. Surely there was some distance between them, so Anne couldn't take a closer look at his face and eyes. But as far as this story goes, there was a weird feeling of normalcy to the story. Just like this story would be more about a glitch in the Matrix than an actual ghost story. Well, whatever the opinion that you might have on this, I would be happy to hear your thoughts on this one. On to the third and last story. This is my own experience, and it is maybe more a story of perfect timing between our thoughts and the happenings in the real world than it is a goosebump-inducing one. This took place when I was fairly young, at my early teens, I guess. It was summertime, and my summers were always laden with perfect happiness, as my family left our city home and spent the holidays in the country in perfect peace and freedom. My family owned a small bungalow, a half-hour walk from my grandmother's place, and also the house of my cousins, who were roughly the same age as I was. I considered them to be practically like sisters to me. During the summer, I used to spend a great deal of time with my cousins, and I often stayed the night with them at a small guest house next to their home. This small wooden building had no heating or light, so it could only be used in the summer, but it was a fantasy realm ruled by our minds inclined towards all things mysterious. We used to camp out in the guest room, equipped with flashlights, and stay up until at least 3 a.m. while chatting and reading horror literature, some of which I still remember very well, especially Eric Maple's Guide to the Supernatural World. Well, one evening, we were lying in our beds, tucked under the warm duvet in the cool guest house, and we were quietly discussing werewolves. We were accustomed to trying to keep our voices hushed, because when we first started to spend our nights in the guest house, we had made such a racket while fooling around that it had kept my cousin's parents up all night, and they had been really pissed off about it. But to get back to the story, we were talking in lowered voices and discussing how one could possibly survive an attack by a werewolf, when suddenly a heavy weight crashed against the door of the guest house. My cousins and I heard some snarling, the sound of a large dog panting heavily, and the sound of paws padding about on the terrace, with its nails making a clicking sound and scratching on the wooden boards of the terrace. There was one more leap against the door, as if the animal was trying to jump high enough to reach the window at the top part of the door. But after that, it was gone on its way. We couldn't see the animal at all, so I assume it wasn't quite as large enough to reach the window, but still strong enough to hit the door with a heavy bang. We were all dumbfounded for a good while after this surprising animal attack, especially because it came curiously in sync with us discussing werewolves. I suppose that it was just a runaway dog, but there was no trace of it when I got up and took a look out through the window. And to add a little bit to the mix, there were no dogs like that in the surrounding houses in the nearby areas. Well, how would you like a little bit of snarling outside your door at night time? We certainly opted to spend the night very quietly after that, once and for all. I love dogs, and actually I miss some dogs much more than their respective owners, but to have a nighttime visit from a sneering large doggy is a bit too much, don't you think? Okay, good night now. I will continue to make my Christmas preparations right now. I just love Christmas and this very dark time of year. Hope you do too. So have a very Merry Christmas and see you soon. Mwah.